The story everyone knows is that the Soviets lost the race to the moon. But what few realize is how thoroughly they erased all evidence of their attempt. So much so that by 1974, Walter Cronkite told the American public on national television that the moon race had never even taken place. For decades, this version of history went unchallenged. Almost everyone bought it. They were all wrong. Hidden behind a fence in the frozen expanse of Kazakhstan, in the heart of a merciless winter, stood the largest rocket ever built by the Soviet Union. It was called the N-1, a towering behemoth taller than a 30-story building. Its first stage was powered by an incredible 30 engines clustered together, more than any rocket before or since. This giant was designed to put a Soviet cosmonaut on the moon's surface before Neil Armstrong and his crew could land there. But it failed. Not once, but 3 times. Each failure was met with silence and denial, a refusal to acknowledge the rocket's very existence. This is the untold story of the Soviet moon program, the secret they tried desperately to bury. Back in May of 1961, President John F. Kennedy took to Congress and boldly declared that America would land a man on the moon before the decade was out. At the time, Americans had barely spent 15 minutes in space. The Soviets, on the other hand, had already put the first satellite into orbit, the first living creature, and the first human being, Yuri Gagarin, into space. Yet for 3 years, Moscow remained silent. The Kremlin dismissed the Apollo program as bluster. Nikita Khrushchev was focused on military missiles, and the space program was seen more as a propaganda tool than a serious moon project. Propaganda, after all, didn't necessarily need moon rockets. It wasn't until August of 1964 that the Soviet leadership finally took the American challenge seriously. But by then, the gap was too wide. The decree authorizing a Soviet-manned lunar landing arrived only 2 months before Khrushchev's fall from power. The man tasked with making the moon landing a reality was Sergei Korolev, the brilliant chief designer of the Soviet space program, the same man behind Sputnik and Gagarin's historic flight. Korolev was already worn down by years of relentless pressure, and he had less than 2 years left to live, though no one yet knew it. Korolev had dreamed of building a heavy-lift rocket since 1956. His early designs imagined a super rocket, a 2,000-ton monster with 66 engines in its first stage and a nuclear-powered second stage. The nuclear plans were scrapped in 1959 after realizing conventional fuels could achieve similar results with far less risk. What remained was a design featuring a monolithic first stage with a cluster of medium-thrust engines, fueled by liquid oxygen and kerosene. By 1962, Korolev's design bureau had completed a draft for what they now called the N-1 rocket. It was to have a liftoff mass of 2,000 tons, capable of lifting 75 tons to low Earth orbit, powered by 24 engines on its first stage. Official approval to build the rocket came that September, with a promised first launch in 1965. That deadline came and went, as did 1966, without a launch. Korolev's final lunar mission plan was known as the N-1L3 complex. Unlike the Americans, who planned 2 launches to get astronauts to the moon, the Soviets aimed to do it all with a single enormous rocket carrying 1 cosmonaut to the lunar surface. This meant everything had to work perfectly: the stages, separations, and lander. The lander, called the LK, was minimalistic: no seat inside, the cosmonaut would have to stand at the controls during the descent. There was no tunnel linking the lander to the orbiter like Apollo had. To transfer between spacecraft, the cosmonaut would have to exit in a spacesuit and walk across the hull. It wasn't reckless. It was simply what could fit on 1 rocket. And that rocket was the Achilles heel. The N-1 was designed in a rush, with a budget that was always too tight, by a man who despised the engineer best suited to build its engines. Korolev refused to work with Valentin Glushko, the Soviet Union's top rocket engine designer, because Glushko had denounced him during Stalin's purges in 1938. Korolev himself had spent over a year in the brutal labor camps of Kolyma before being moved to a prison for engineers. The wounds were deep and unhealed. So, for the N-1 engines, Korolev turned to Nikolai Kuznetsov, whose factory had spent 20 years making turboprop engines for bombers but had no experience building large rocket engines. Kuznetsov agreed to take the challenge. The result was the NK-15 engine, clever, efficient, producing about 150 tons of thrust. The N-1 needed 30 of these engines firing simultaneously, perfectly synchronized, and never before tested together in a full-scale ground test. There was no funding to build such a test stand. The first time all 30 engines would fire together was on the launch pad. Glushko had proposed an alternative: larger engines, fewer in number, running on storable but toxic fuels like nitrogen tetroxide and hydrazine. These were easier to handle and more reliable in some ways but produced about 20% less performance than Korolev's choice of liquid oxygen and kerosene. Korolev rejected this approach, and Glushko refused to build the kerosene engines Korolev wanted. So, Kuznetsov's smaller engines and their complex cluster were all they had. The grudge between Korolev and Glushko became a literal design limitation. Meanwhile, a small Soviet institute called TSNI-MASH was tasked with calculating the chances of success for the first N-1 launch. They examined the failure history of every Soviet rocket and missile ever built. The initial odds of a complete mission success came out to just over 1%, a dismal figure. Yuri Mazarin, who led TSNI-MASH, knew he couldn't present that to the Politburo. So, he ordered his team to recalculate, this time excluding failures caused by manufacturing defects or human error, counting only failures from unknown physics. The new figure was 67%, which he presented instead. The room fell silent. Even with that rosier number, no sane engineer would launch a rocket with a 1 in 3 chance of catastrophic failure. Nikolai Pilyagin, head of the flight control system, was the first to speak. He argued the only valid criterion for launch was the personal assurance of every chief designer that their system would work. The room agreed, and Mazarin agreed fastest. This meant no one could blame his organization if things went wrong. The decision to launch the N-1 wasn't based on engineering. It was a vote among men who couldn't afford to say no. There was no time left. The Americans were closing in fast. Apollo 8 had just orbited the moon. So, they went ahead. That brings us to February 21, 1969. The first N-1, Vehicle 3L, stood ready on the pad in brutally cold weather, 44 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, with fierce winds capable of knocking a man down. The area was evacuated. 50 railway tankers had filled the rocket with kerosene and liquid oxygen. The countdown reached 0. And the 30 engines of the first stage took 12 seconds to build enough thrust to lift the rocket off the pad. It rose into a clear blue sky on a pillar of fire and black smoke. People miles away heard a deafening roar that lasted several seconds. Then, about 1 minute into flight, the engines suddenly shut down. The rocket climbed briefly on momentum, then began to fall, crashing 52 kilometers away in the snow. The investigation took 3 months. What they found was startling. Around 6 seconds after liftoff, a small pressure pipe inside engine number 2 broke due to high-frequency vibrations. At 25 seconds, a fuel pipe broke in the same engine, spraying kerosene inside the rocket. Hot gases met fuel, sparking a fire in the tail compartment about 55 seconds after liftoff. The fire melted the insulation on wiring controlling the engine management system called KORD. An automated supervisor monitoring all 30 engines for trouble. The damaged wiring fed false signals to KORD, which interpreted them as a total engine failure and shut down all engines simultaneously at 68.7 seconds. The rocket hadn't actually failed yet. The fire had killed the very system meant to save it. The shutdown signal also cut power to the second and third stages, paralyzing the entire vehicle. British intelligence picked up the launch attempt, but American spy satellites somehow missed it. For years, the CIA insisted no launch had taken place. The Soviets said nothing. Weeks before the launch, propaganda chief Yuri Mazarin had prepared 3 press release versions, none mentioning the moon. Officially, the N-1 was either a research vehicle, a heavy science satellite, or simply non-existent. The Soviet line was that there was no moon program. Now, the second failed launch marked the beginning of the end. By spring 1969, the schedule was in ruins. Korolev had been dead for 3 years. He died in January 1966 during what was supposed to be routine surgery for a colon polyp in Moscow. The Minister of Health himself performed the operation, discovering the polyp was a tumor. The surgery lasted 5 hours, and Korolev's body, scarred from years in labor camps, did not survive. He was 59. His successor, Vasily Mishin, was a capable engineer but lacked Korolev's political savvy. Mishin couldn't inspire the workforce or secure state resources the way Korolev had. When funding decisions loomed, he failed to convince leadership to continue a program everyone saw as doomed. Meanwhile, the Americans had flown Apollo 9, testing the lunar module in Earth orbit, and Apollo 10 was about to fly, bringing the lunar module within 15 kilometers of the Moon's surface. Apollo 11 was scheduled for that summer. The Soviets had one last chance. If they could launch the second N-1 in early July, they could send an unmanned spacecraft on a lunar loop, bringing it home. At the same time, they planned to launch Luna 15, a smaller robotic probe on a Proton rocket, to land on the Moon, scoop up lunar soil, and return it before the Americans. It wouldn't be a manned landing, but it might steal some glory, and allow the Soviets to claim, with a straight face, that they had never been racing for the Moon at all. That the whole thing was a Western fantasy. Vehicle 5L rolled out to the launch pad in late June, carrying a modified spacecraft, a lander mock-up and a working escape tower. The launch was set for the night of July 3, 2 weeks before Apollo 11. Engineers were cautiously optimistic. They had moved the KORD system out of the engine compartment where it had been vulnerable to fire, placing it in a safer intertank section. Ventilation openings were added for cooling, and filters installed to keep metal debris out of turbopumps. But these fixes were rushed, often based on marked-up sketches rather than finalized plans. 3 shifts of workers labored around the clock for months. Then, disaster struck. The rocket lifted off normally. But just a quarter of a second after the engines reached full thrust, the oxidizer pump on engine number 8 ingested a tiny piece of metal debris and exploded. A fire ignited at the base as the rocket rose past the top of the launch tower. This time, KORD responded correctly, shutting down engines in pairs. Thrust dropped below the rocket's weight. It leveled off briefly, then tilted 45 degrees and began falling back toward the pad. The escape tower fired, pulling the empty crew capsule to safety. The rest of the rocket, still full of liquid oxygen and kerosene, crashed into the launch complex, detonating one of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever recorded. Witnesses said the blast rivaled a small nuclear explosion. Shock waves shattered windows miles away. The launch pad, years in the making, was reduced to a crater. American satellites caught the disaster within hours. The damage was so severe, repairs took 18 months. The Soviet lunar program was effectively over in that instant. 3 weeks later, on July 20, 1969, Apollo 11 touched down in the Sea of Tranquility. At almost the exact moment Armstrong and Aldrin stepped onto the Moon, Luna 15 attempted its own descent but crashed into the Sea of Crises. The metaphor was so stark it could have been a novel's tragic twist. The Soviets said nothing. Officially, Luna 15 was just a routine science mission. Officially, the N-1 never existed. The explosion site was hidden from satellite imagery as best as possible. The footage of the blast was classified. Program records were sealed tight. Here lies the astonishing truth. Walter Cronkite, in 1974, told the American public that the Russians had never been in the moon race. The London Sunday Times said the same in 1971. The New York Times had declared it in 1964. By 1989, NBC News was producing specials narrated by Leonard Nimoy, stating bluntly that the space race wasn't really a race at all. None of these journalists were lying. They simply didn't know what had happened in the frozen steppes of Kazakhstan. The Soviets had buried the evidence so deeply that even the victors started doubting if there had ever been a contest. By the mid-70s, a narrative took hold. the Soviets lost interest in the moon by 1963. The truth was far more complicated, and far more tragic. In the 1960s, a story began to take shape. The Soviets gave up on the moon by 1963. But the reality wasn't so simple, and it was far more heartbreaking. Contrary to the belief that the moon race was just a NASA ploy to squeeze money from Congress or a staged spectacle, the Soviets were pushing as hard as they could behind the scenes. Their efforts were plagued by failures on a massive scale, failures so severe and costly that any open program would have been shut down immediately. Yet, for years, they kept these setbacks under wraps, hiding the truth behind layers of secrecy and denial. What makes the Soviet N-1 rocket program truly peculiar isn't just that it failed. Rocket failures happen all the time. It's how it failed. To understand this, it helps to compare it to its American counterpart, the Saturn V. NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, led by Wernher von Braun, built the Saturn V that took Apollo 11 to the moon. Its first stage was powered by 5 F-1 engines, each one pumping out roughly 700 tons of thrust. The program launched 32 Saturn rockets of various types, and not a single one suffered a catastrophic failure. The difference with the Soviet N-1 is striking. The Americans built 5 huge, thoroughly tested engines and trusted them. The Soviets, on the other hand, built 30 smaller engines, never tested all of them firing together on the ground, and just hoped for the best. But that's only part of the story. The American space effort had a clear chain of command, one organization, NASA, with a single administrator, one budget, and a unified mission. The Soviet program was a tangled mess. 4 rival design bureaus, each led by a man with fierce personal and political animosities, Sergei Korolev, Valentin Glushko, Mikhail Yengel, and Vladimir Kulamai, vied for control. Each wanted to build the moon rocket and had powerful backers in different corners of the Soviet government. This rivalry led to competing rocket designs that would have replaced each other if they had ever been built. Yengel's R-56 and Kulamai's UR-700 were seen as more conservative, practical options than the N-1. Both designs used clusters of rocket modules that could be transported by rail and assembled at the launch site, powered by Glushko's storable propellants. Yet neither ever made it off the drawing board. Instead, the Soviet space program spent years locked in a slow-motion civil war among its chief engineers. And the winners were decided not by engineering merit but by political maneuvering. By August 1964, when Korolev was officially assigned the lunar mission, there were 3 serious rocket proposals under consideration. But by the time the N-1 was finally chosen, the Americans had already begun bending metal on the Saturn V. Soviet engineers were not lacking intelligence or effort. They worked with less money, less time, less political support, and a chief designer who outright refused to collaborate with the country's best engine builder because of a grudge going back 3 decades. They operated in a culture where bad news could be deadly. The man who calculated that the first N-1 launch had only a 1% chance of success was pressured to improve that number, which he did, knowing full well it was a falsehood. Everyone in the room understood it was a lie, but the launch went forward anyway. This mindset, this desperation to hide the truth, is what the Soviets buried, not just the massive explosions. After the infamous first launch failure, 2 more attempts followed. The third launch, in June 1971, known as Vehicle 6L, featured significant redesigns, filters added to propellant lines, changes to the tail's aerodynamics, and a new white paint job meant to keep the engine compartment cooler during the summer. The flight plan also included a new evasive maneuver designed to push the rocket away from the launch pad immediately after liftoff to prevent another disaster like the first. But the maneuver overcorrected. As the rocket cleared the tower and began its programmed roll, the interaction of 30 engine exhaust plumes with the surrounding air created an axial spin the control system couldn't counteract. The vehicle developed an uncontrollable roll and, about 50 seconds into the flight, as it passed through the zone of maximum aerodynamic stress, it broke apart. Range safety officers destroyed what was left. The fourth and final launch, Vehicle 7L, happened in November 1972. By then, engineers had improved the rocket's tail design, added powerful roll engines for steering, and completely overhauled the telemetry systems. The flight started off well, lasting 107 seconds, nearly reaching the first stage separation point. But then, a programmed shutdown of 6 central engines, designed to reduce structural stress, caused a hydraulic hammer in the propellant lines. A fuel line ruptured, the oxidizer pump on engine number 4 exploded, and the rocket disintegrated midair. Afterward, blame flew around. The mission team faulted the engine designers. The engine team pointed to the propellant lines. Everyone agreed that if the central engines hadn't been shut down, the first stage might have completed its burn. By the time 7L blew up, Apollo 17 had already returned from the moon. The race wasn't just lost, the Soviet moon program had been dead for 3 years. 2 more N-1 rockets, 8L and 9L, were fully assembled and ready to fly. Their new NK-33 and NK-43 engines had passed rigorous ground tests, and many engineers genuinely believed the next launch would succeed. But they never got the chance. In May 1974, Vasily Mishin, Korolev's successor and head of the program, was replaced by Valentin Glushko, the very engine designer Korolev had refused to work with. Glushko promptly cancelled the entire program. The 2 finished rockets were dismantled. Fuel tanks were converted into carports and storage sheds at the Cosmodrome, and payload fairings became picnic sunshades. The cancellation was as much political as technical. Glushko had spent years opposing the N-1, and now in charge, he had no interest in defending it. But there were still 150 engines sitting in a warehouse, built by Kuznetsov's factory for the cancelled program. Glushko ordered them destroyed. Kuznetsov didn't obey. He had devoted his career to those engines and had nothing else to show. So he sealed the warehouse and walked away. That's not quite the end of the story for those engines. 2 decades later, after the Soviet Union collapsed, an American aerospace company called Aerojet purchased a batch of those stored N-1 engines. Redesigned and renamed AJ-26, they were tested in the United States and found to work. They were even considered for use on American rockets, including a launch vehicle named Antares. During their American service, there was at least 1 test stand explosion and 1 in-flight failure traced to engine components, though the exact causes remain debated. The key takeaway isn't the failure rate but the fact that these engines worked at all. Designed in the 1960s by an engineer with no prior experience building large rocket engines, for a program his country denied, these engines flew on American rockets well into the 21st century. Many questions about the N-1 program remain unanswered, and may never be fully known. How many workers died building and fueling those rockets? The accident records were classified, and few have been declassified. Would the fully assembled 8L rocket have succeeded? Its improved engines completed ground tests, and the redesign was finalized. Several engineers believed until their deaths that the next launch would have worked. But we'll never know if they were right, and even if they were, the Americans had already won the race. Whether the Soviets had come second 3 years later or 5 wouldn't have changed history's memory. The cosmonauts trained for the lunar landing remain a mystery, too. Men like Alexei Leonov, the first human to walk in space, were selected for the mission. They trained on simulators for the LK lander, flew helicopters mimicking its descent, and studied lunar geology. Year after year, they were told the next launch would be the one. The training group was officially disbanded in October 1973. None ever reached the moon. Some spoke quietly about it after the Soviet collapse, but most kept their thoughts guarded. They had spent a decade preparing for a mission the world didn't even know existed. Today, the remains of the N-1 program are mostly silence. The launch pads at Baikonur are falling apart. The roof of the assembly building has collapsed. The apartment blocks where workers once lived stand empty. Tumbleweeds grow among rusting parts in the Cosmodrome's old recreation areas. A handful of engines sit in museums or private collections. A few LK lander prototypes survive, scattered across Russian technology centers, aviation institutes, and a museum at the Moscow Aviation Institute. These small spacecraft, about 5 meters tall and designed to carry a single cosmonaut, never flew with a person on board. The grainy, silent footage of the 4N1 launches, once classified for 30 years, was finally released in the late 1980s. It shows a massive rocket rising against a clear sky, only to fall back down, 4 times over 4 years, in a country that no longer exists. Watching those rockets now, there's a haunting truth: they don't know they're about to fail. They lift off with the same confidence as any rocket bound for the moon. The flames blaze bright, the smoke trails smooth. For the first minute or so, there's no way to tell if a rocket will succeed or explode. In a way, that's what the Soviets tried to hide, not just the explosions, but the fact that those failures looked just like success until the very last second. The Sea of Tranquility and the Sea of Crises are both real places on the moon, nearly 600 miles apart. Apollo 11 landed in one. Luna 15 crashed in the other. Both remain there, silent witnesses to a race that changed history.